Assalamu alaikum and greetings. Welcome everyone. I pray you're well. My name is Saqib, your host on the Hikmah Project podcast. Today we'll be talking about one of my great heroes, and well, I just lack words every time I think of him, Amīr al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī. But before I speak more about that, just an update. We are planning a e-course with Dr. Fawzia al-Rafai. She'll be back again this Ramadan and will be giving talks. We will also be exploring her book as an e-course throughout the month, and she has 30 wonderful themes, one for each day, and we'll be supporting that with Sufi Quranic commentary on various verses as well. So more details on that in due course. So today we are speaking to Dr. Ramzi Taleb. He has his BA and MA from the University of Toronto, originally from Algeria, and he has been a student of Dr. Said Hussein Nasser in terms of his spiritual path, and then later Sheikh Fawzi Karkahi from Morocco. He did both his master's and doctorate on the great Sheikh Amīr al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī. I'll put a link to his PhD thesis in the podcast notes on the website, and it's entitled Amīr al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī, Mystical Hermeneutic, Theology and Metaphysics in his Kitab al-Mawaqif. And so we explore both the historical dimension but also the spiritual dimension of this great man who sort of embodied masculinity in the true sense of the word, and was carried a certain sort of archetype of the saint, scholar, warrior that we see exemplified in Imam Ali, rahmatullah alayhi. So it's but he's just so amazing and just defies words. And we dive into his relationship with Ibn Arabi. He was through and through Akbarian. We look at what he says in his Mawaqif, and some spiritual engagement he had with Sheikh al-Akbar, his relationship with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and we also mention, we talk about his Sheikh, who he meets at the age of 50 and then goes into retreat in Mecca, in the Prophet's cave in Hira. And so there's many sort of dimensions to this great figure, who is often known as a well respected as a military commander who led the Algerian resistance against French colonialism, but was recognized for his integrity and impeccable character from the likes of Abraham Lincoln to even the actual French authorities recognized how brilliant this man was. And so we explore these various themes and go more into the metaphysics as well through his Kitab al-Mawaqif. So without further ado, here's the podcast. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor for me to be having this podcast today with Dr. Ramzi Taleb. Dr. Ramzi, welcome to the Hikmah Project podcast.
Wa alaikum salam, Saqib. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really grateful and blessed for this opportunity to share conversation today, inshallah, with you, and also, inshallah, with the audience.
Alhamdulillah. And it's one of my great honors to be able to do this today, because Sheikh Amīr al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī, as the listeners will discover, is just such a phenomenal person. I don't have words to describe him. And so before we delve into him, can you say a bit about yourself? How is it you came to do your thesis in this great Sheikh? And was it just an intellectual endeavor, or was it a spiritual as well?
Yes, well, that's a good question, Saqib. Taking on the topic of Abd al-Qādir as a thesis It's actually on sort of multi-layered. It's personal, it is intellectual, but also spiritual. First of all, myself and Abdul Qadir were both from Algeria, and any Algerian knows him as an iconic figure in Algerian history. Mostly, most people, even in Algeria, know him as the foremost kind of leader of the resistance. But there's a few circles, very small circles, who know him as part of a large Sufi group, that he belonged to a genuine and powerful, actually, Sufi order, and also know him not only as a leader but as a spiritual and a saintly man. So this was always hovering in our minds, especially when it's like a foreign homeland. We all love figures who have shaped history. But over time, when I started to read Ibn Arabi in the Sufi tradition as a graduate students, I was very surprised at some point. I can't remember the juncture when actually I do remember now. Michel Chodkovitz, the very first French scholar who wrote on Ibn Arabi, and on the French side of scholarship of Ibn Arabi, he was the very first one to really open that gate that ʿAbd al-Jazāījī represent one of the last post-classical commentator on Ibn Arabi, that really very few people have actually taken the time to appreciate him. A lot of the Ibn Arabi scholars know about his students, Qunawi, Qaisari, Kashani, but on the North African side, Chodkovitz was the first one, and that really triggered another layer of many people love the readings of Ibn Arabi, but when I kind of connected the dots, I realized that Abdul Qādir not only is a really inspired commentator of Ibn Arabi in the 19th century, and it really opened a new line of research. And it was, as I said, it comes historically because it's from the homeland. Intellectually and spiritually, I grew up in North Africa, or Sufism is a big tradition, but then Abdul Qadir seems to really give me the material, the raw material, because no one has ever worked on him, not only as a commentator, but as also a Sufi in his own right, like a remarkable Sufi Gnostic and metaphysician. And then during my master's, I decided I'm going to embark on this work. Yeah.
Amazing. And so let's delve a bit into the historical context of the great Amir. And before we delve into his works, what sort of world did he live in? I mean, I would imagine, based on what I've heard and read, the little that I have, is obviously there was the rise of French colonization. So he must have seen that, presumably the decline of the Muslims. So it'd be very interesting to hear how he interpreted that, and then just the remarkable stories you hear about him in terms of the khalwa he did in Ghar Hira and in the Prophet's mosque, how he saw the Prophet in a waking state, how he, I think in his Muwaqif, he talks about having conversations with Ibn Arabi in the Ghaib around the Fusus, and then people like Abraham Lincoln honoring him with like two rifles, and having streets in America being named after him. So it seems like a really remarkable time, and as you said, it's like the end of the classical period, and he represents somebody who I think Sheikh Hamza Yusuf spoke about him as being like one of the last Muslims, as they talk about the last of Mohicans. He's like one of the last of those authentic Muslims. And I was trying to put together, I was trying to explain how could I add people up together to equate him. And I was thinking of, Khabib, the great MMA fighter,
yes,
and, Ertugrul, and then on the scholarship, I couldn't think of anyone alive today that I could say he's on par of Amir Abdul Qadir in terms of his depth of thinking. And I just couldn't put together, 3 or 4 figures who would equate him. But yeah, so could you just tell us more about his historical context and the world he lived in, and what shaped him? Thank you.
Yes. Well, let's start from the beginning. so before Abdul Qadir becomes Amir, a commander of the faithful. So we have a figure who is born in in 1803 in the northwestern Algeria, very small village. It's called Maaskar, a very beautiful oasis in Algeria. Now we have Abdul Qadir born into a Sharif family, a very, very noble family, descendant from the Holy Prophet, والسلام, and there's not only the Sharifian descent, and it's really big. The religious aristocracy in North Africa has always been something that shaped socio-political culture until, I mean, at least before the 20th century. If you belong to the Sharifian line, that's a big badge. But they really belong, the family of Abdul Qadir belongs to the cream of the Sharifian line. His father, his grandfather, they're scholars. The Zawiya of Abdul Qadir's father, major intellectual hub during his lifetime. Before all the conflict and the first kind of waves of tension begins with France, he was born to thrive in the spiritual and intellectual tradition of the Sufi Qadiri tradition. His family, his ancestor, they all belong to not only the Sharifian, and you add over the Sharifian lineage, the Sufi spiritual lineage, which as many know is traced back 99% of all Sufi orders will go back to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And so Abdul Qadir is born into this. He's born into Muhyiddin, his father, by the way, he's Muhyiddin, who is the political mediator between the Arab tribes and the Ottoman authorities in Algeria. He is an accomplished scholar, jurist, and theologian, but also a spiritual mentor in the Sufi Qadiri tradition. Abdul Qadir is one of, if I'm not wrong, one of 4 children, and the last one to be born. And he was destined, and he tells that even in his work, in his autobiography, he was destined for scholarship, to pursue the. He said, he was born a contemplative, and by the time he was youth, he had already learned a lot of the sciences, which is really remarkable. Very few people know that. Not only he learned the religious sciences, the basic, naqli, transmitted sciences, but he learned mathematics, he learned astronomy, even pharmacy, zoology, and also horsemanship. A very well-rounded training, and nothing pointed to a man who's going to move, and he moved from scholarship and the spiritual path to armed resistance. So at the age of 17, a major event happens in his life. His father takes him to Hajj from Algeria. As we many know, in that time you had to actually take a caravan. So Algeria to Mecca would probably take close to 6 months, sometimes longer. They stopped at different places. One of them, of course, was going back to the roots, Abdul Qadir Jilani. They stopped in Egypt, where Muhammad Ali, the great political reformer, was alive, and Abdul Qadir is exposed to what's a new wave of changes in the Muslim world. But then the pilgrimage was from Egypt. You stop in Egypt typically, and then Damascus, but then they had to go to their ancestor, the descendant of Abdul Qadir Jilani. They go there. One of the episode there may be worth mentioning, that because there are this is how history really perceive him. When Abdul Qadir and the entourage of Abdul Qadir and his father enter into the shrine of Abdul Qadir Jilani, he stays outside, and then there is some kind of an encounter that someone comes out from the shrine and speak to his father, and he said, "Show me your sultan or your emir." And then they're very surprised, like, who's this man, or who's this sultan? And then he said, your sultan is with you. I want to see your sultan. And then everyone is kind of doesn't really get the message. But then he pointed out that Abdul Qadir al-Jazā'irí, the reading was that this maybe apparition was a premonition of Abdul Qadir becoming the emir or the sultan of the resistance. He accomplishes his Hajj, and then he comes at the age of 17. He comes back to pursue his education from 17 until 24. everything was pointing out as spiritual, intellectual tradition. And he was quite accomplished. By the age of maybe 18, he was already a mufti. But between 17 and 24, he's still in the spiritual intellectual pursuits. A little bit of tensions here and there between the Arab tribes and the Ottoman authorities, but by and large, nothing really. The situation and the context, historical context in Algeria is very stable. And of course, 23 years old, 24 years old, this is 1832, where there is a major, confrontation between the French ambassadors and the Ottomans in Algeria. And the Ottomans vacate Algeria, and a new, basically, call for armed resistance is announced. Muhammad Muhyiddin, the father of Abd al-Qādir, takes up the allegiance of the tribes. They are at the forefront of basically confronting a superpower. The French was a superpower at the time, and then Muhyiddin was in his 70s, and he witnesses that Abd al-Qādir was absolutely excelling in the battlefield at the age of 22. And so he was fashioned exactly like Ali, the archetype of warrior saint, the fatah, the chivalrous comportment and skills, and all of that was coming along in a young prime Abd al-Qādir. At the age of 24, his father, summons all the tribes who are basically from the lines around him. And today we might be quite surprised. Abd al-Qādir took the resistance at the age of 24 against a superpower. And then not shortly thereafter, his father passed away. And can go too much into it. There's so much literature on the political life. 15 years of resistance by 24 years old, who completely eluded the French until the very last moment, where he decided to just kind of give up arms for various reasons. We have 15 years of resistance. Afterwards, Abd al-Qādir basically, he's betrayed by the French authorities when they signed the treaty. Instead of taking him to an exile in the Muslim world, they betrayed him and they took him to France. But it is signed by Abd al-Qādir and the French authority was a safe exile, and he would renounce political engagement for the rest of his life. But as Providence would have it, a man of that character, of that phenomenal impact, had to go through even more trials. 5 years of house imprisonment in France, during which he's going back to his initial contemplative. He never really broke away, even during the resistance. Very, very enshrined and embedded in the contemplative Sufi tradition. Someone who's always in retreat, in spiritual practice. In imprisonment, he intensifies spiritual retreats and then his practices. And then 5 years afterwards, Napoleon III, the emperor, decided to honor, after many petitions, and he even lost some of his children who were born in France, and they died very young. He lost quite a few. And 5 years later, after the interventions of many diplomats and so on, they grant him exile to Syria. To Damascus, which where he wanted to be, not for randomly, because he had an attachment to Ibn Arabi. He was received, spent, in fact, what many people don't know, he lived longer in Damascus than he actually spent his life resisting the French. Almost 24 years of his life was not in resistance. He was in Damascus, and then he becomes the center of a major Sufi revival. Abd al-Qādir emerges as, we're going to talk about his spiritual types. He goes into retreat in Mecca for a year and a half, and he meets he's never had a official spiritual sheikh until he goes to Mecca. He meets Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi, the Darqawi, and this was, as I put it in my work, the catalytic sheikh. When Abd al-Qādir meets at the age of 50, his sheikh, he puts him into a retreat in the cave of Hira, where the Holy Prophet received his revelation, and Abd al-Qādir returns to Damascus as He was, I mean, there's this really irony and paradox about someone who attained self-realization before meeting a sheikh, but then after meeting the sheikh, the initiatory sheikh, there is like an outpouring of wisdom, and he comes back and he really triggers one of the most impactful Sufi revival traditions in Damascus and in the wider Arab Ottoman world. This is part of the thing I try to do in the research, and he emerges as a a Sufi metaphysician of first order saint and metaphysician, but also a commentator on Ibn Arabi. And this legacy is really little known by his readers. This is partly why I conducted the research. And as you said in the beginning, you're probably right in many respects. It's very hard to think about a historical figure of that scale and that impact. It's really, like Michel Chodkovich, may God bless his soul, remarked, he really represented the pole of, sainthood in all respect on the horizontal level, the active life and the contemplative life. It's really impossible to pin him down. I mean, as you said, he reminds he's really figuratively kind of a resurrection of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Really, he embodies the futuwa of Ali ibn Abi Talib, chivalry. He embodies the saintliness and the walaya of Ali ibn Talib and the Prophet, but also scholarship. And even remarkably, if you just read about his military campaign and strategies, it is the French were absolutely amazed. It's no surprise that even the French has honored him as one of the greatest human beings to have ever lived in the century. Many of the French who met him, and this journalist, the political, they knew that this was one of the most exceptional destinies in human history. Even his biographer, the distant cousin of Winston Churchill, Henry Churchill, who actually wrote the biography of al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī, he lived with him for 1 year to write it down. If you read the last chapter of the biography he said, there is no doubt that this man is one of the greatest human being that the Islamic tradition has ever produced. And he put him on pair with, they named one of the historians of the time, they named 3 people. And these are not Muslims. They are historians who actually witnessed the events of the 19th century. They named 3 people who they believed to be the greatest people of 19th century. Al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī, Imam Shamil, by the way, a very distant ancestor of Khabib. That's his ancestor, Imam Shamil. And the third one was Muhammad Ali, the semi-political reformers of Egypt in the 19th century. But I would say, today there are so many literatures and exhibitions, but it seems like Abd al-Qādir was really overshadowed virtually anyone who lived in his lifetime. Besides, of course, if you read his mystical poems, you would think this is someone who it may be Ibn Arabi, maybe Hallaj, maybe it's really the pinnacle of self-realization on all fronts. I guess maybe this gives us some impression, very glimpse of something that we can actually comprehend even collectively. It's a really remarkable destiny on fronts. So, but by the grace of God, the writing of Mawaqif is probably one prism where we start to judge something really beyond the scale of imagination, someone who embodies like this mythical Sufi saint in the early modern era. So this is kind of a rough sketch of how Abd al-Qādir features in this historical context of the 19th century.
Amazing. And so I just want to pick up on one of the themes you pointed out there, and that's the archetype in the Islamic tradition of the saint, scholar, warrior, which I think as Imam Ali was a par excellence example of that.
Yes.
And in the Islamic tradition, it's just interesting if we were to just look at the history of humanity and look at various archetypes of spiritual people. You've got the yogi, the dervish, the lover, the divine lover that is, and that sort of thing. So, but it seems like in the Islamic tradition, we also have this archetype of people who embodied, who spent their nights in zikr and were very active during the day, and but their level of scholarship excels or exceeds any contemporary or your normal scholar. Yet at the same time, they are exceptional in the battlefield or in their active life. And what I want to ask is, how do you think his spirituality informed his political activism? And the context of the question is, I have a very good friend of mine who runs the Thinking Muslim podcast, Jalal, and often there is almost like a disparity between Sufi sort of thinking of, say, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, al-Ghazali, and political thought within the Muslim, sphere. Yet Sheikh Amir al-Qādir Jazā'i seems to be integrating them in a very holistic way, in which they're synthesized, as you said, the active and the passive pole. It's almost like one informs the other. If he didn't have the spiritual, he wouldn't be as active. So could you talk a bit about that archetype in Islamic history and this role of the spiritual informing the political and his thinking?
Yes. Well, this is, in fact, this is a good question, because first, trying to really declutter certain narratives. The unfortunate things about scholarship, especially scholarship of Sufi scholarship, at least, we're in the early, maybe mid-20th century. Largely, the Western scholarship of Sufi tradition has kind of painted the tradition as a very passive tradition. But every fact actually proves that wrong. Until, I would say, anyone who has just a very, very, brief familiarity with the history of crusades, the crusade with the Muslim traditions, right? There was almost 11 crusades in the history between, the Christians and Muslims. On almost every occasion, even if you read the Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, one of the legendary military figure, not only did he was himself actually initiated into a Sufi tradition. Some of them, there is a door in modern-day Palestine, in Quds, that is called, Bab al-Maghariba, the door of the North Africans and so on. And if you read about it, for example, on every occasion, the Sufis were at the forefront of military resistance. It was always part and parcel of a tradition enshrined in the Quran and the Hadith. And how do they perceive that? You have, of course, the archetype of, Sufi warrior or saintly warrior begins, of course, with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But then the embodiment of is Ali. Ali is the embodiment of the active and the contemplative tradition. Where does it come from? It comes, of course, from a certain, temperament that is so unique to Ali. But we have two traditions that the Prophet ﷺ basically conveys, and this really informs a political resistance: the Jihad al-Akbar and the Jihad al-Asghar, right? And then there's a hadith about the Prophet coming back from a military campaign and then turning to his companions and informing them that we are returning from the lesser exertion or war to the greater jihad or exertion. They ask, what is the lesser jihad? He's armed resistance or or self-defense, as they put it. What is the greater jihad? Is the basically the cultivation of the soul. This is the greatest possible exertion or jihad of the nafs. And sometimes in the history, like the early history of Islam, because of compelling reasons, they merge. They have to, but they both come together. But they have always perceived that self-exertion, purifications of the soul has preeminence even over armed resistance. The thing about this, so there is a tradition at the futuwa. The Prophet says there's no fata, there's no chevalier but Ali, and there's no la safe, there's no sword by Dhul Faqar. So there is a indication, a signal that Ali ibn Abi Talib was that it was the embodiment of these two, the vertical and the horizontal perfections. But if you read about just the manaqib, as they say, the virtues of Sayyidina Ali and so on, you will see that even in the battlefield, it is in the battlefield that the nobility of his soul is exhibited, right? It's in the battlefield, because you can, I mean, al-Qādir makes this point too. He said, why do we say that the exertion of the soul is far greater than armed resistance? He said, because you cannot judge the nobility of the soul in the battlefield, because you cannot judge the intention of a warrior in the soul. Even if he falls, he's a fallen soldier, he may well be doing this for ulterior reasons, for recognition, for fame. So you can't really, but someone who is working on self-exertion, that self-exertion is the ultimate testament of quest, self-purification, and so on. And so, and even Abdul Qadir says that it's much riskier to bring this in the battlefield. But if you combine them like Ali, where you do not, and this is where Futuwa comes, you do not resist, or unresisting is not for your own sake. It's for the sake of justice. It's for the sake of something nobler than even your own victory. So this Futuwa tradition has always been part of the Sufi tradition. Now, yes, not all Sufi Rumi have, not all of them were part of the political and the military, but the tradition of Africa has always been like that. The idea of ribat, this kind of military encampment, it's really, I mean, sometimes it's very nice to put this in comparative language. It really is almost a replicate of the samurai tradition in Japan, the Japanese samurai tradition. One of the things, if you read about the samurai tradition in Japan, one of the things the samurai, and the samurai is someone who goes through intensive spiritual training, and every time before they go, they are always, and it says the samurai is always contemplating death, right? And the resignation of the soul to its destiny. But it's a mystical warrior tradition. You also find even in the Christian tradition, the Templar were like that. They were highly intensely devotees. They were part of the monastic traditions. Same thing, maybe even more so in the North African tradition. Many of the Sufi, if you read just 19th century, Abdul Qadir is one of several, maybe over 6, maybe to 10 Sufi groups who actually engaged in armed resistance against the French. But the synthesization of the contemplative, the active life has always been there, and it really is enshrined. Not, as I said, the Jihad al-Akbar, the greatest jihad, and the lesser jihad. This is like in the tradition, the prophetic tradition. And the Quran as well, because the Quran also speaks about this two element. When you are in that context of having to defend your honor and also exhibit the nobility of the soul, then this seems to really represent a very unique tradition in the Sufi tradition. The Crusades were time and time again repelled because of the Sufi warriors. So they were not. This is one of the mistakes and really misconception that have kind of crept into the narrative, Sufi academic readings, that they are always passive and in a corner. But it's actually a history. I mean, you read about in the Libyan regions, you read about Indonesia, you read about South Africa, West Africa, even before Abdul Qadir, Sheikh Fulani in modern day Nigeria. They all belong to Sufi traditions. Now, never had the political engagement overshadow the practices. The practices are the nourishment of cultivation. So they have, and this is partly, for example, and maybe you would bring it up later, there is a reason why Abdul Qadir Jazāījī always gave precedence to his hostages. when he didn't have enough food in one of the occasions. And this is documented by a priest, a French priest. When ʿAbd al-Qādir was basically they captured some of them, and they did not have enough food to give to the French prisoners, they released them. So this was those same French prisoners who were released because of insufficient food, they came to see him when he was in prison in France. Many of them even embraced Islam because of that. So this tradition of warriorship is there, but it really is so deeply embedded in someone like ʿAbd al-Qādir, like Ali ibn Abi Talib, where the soul has reached a really perfect equilibrium, even in the face of enmity. The nobility of soul has to be completely, fully revealed, right? Futuwa is not vengeful. That's one thing that you really read from Ali. Futuwa has nothing with it to do with vengeful victory. It has to be victory of and even compassion. Futuwa combine compassionate treatment with defense of honor. Honors, the defense of, for example, what they call the right of worship, the defense of what they call the ʿird, or the dignity of people. So these are really have always been part of the Sufi tradition. There's now maybe more scholarships on how the Sufi have been so politically active on this front, but never at the cost of the spiritual practice. The subhan, the what they call the tasbih has always been the kind of the nourishment of Sufis, even those who engage in armed resistance. So this kind of gives us there's a sanad, there's a silsila, there's a chain that goes back from Abd al-Qādir al-Jazāījrī and everyone else back to Ali. And it's Futuwa is the penultimate archetype of masculinity, of manliness, right? It's again, this is a topic for maybe another time, but that's how he fits into that. He fits into this really long-standing tradition.
Amazing. And just before we delve into more of the sort of deeper questions around his works, I just wanted to clarify, maybe if you can expand on some of the stories around him and which build on what you said. So maybe I'll relate a couple that I've heard, and you can verify, the exact context and the validity of the stories. One is when he defended the Christians against the Muslims.
Yes.
I think who were being honored, and he told the Muslims, you are not honoring the tradition of the Prophet by doing this. This is opposite that. So it'd be good to know a bit more about that. And the person you said who wrote a biography about him, who had spent some time with him, mentioned how at night he would be in complete dhikr. He would spend his nights in spiritual practice. And and then the other thing around that, so you mentioned how he embodied this virtue which was recognized even by somebody like Abraham Lincoln, who then gifted him, I think, some horse or some rifles, and in the West somewhere they've got streets named after him. So he was, I think it's very hard to even contemplate the dimensions, the magnanimity of this person, especially I think when you open the Muwaqif, which we'll come to in a minute. But are these stories true? And then so could you tell us a bit more about these stories? And
Yes, of course. Well, this is, this event occurs in roughly 1862. Abd al-Qādir is in exile. He actually lives and settled in Damascus. Actually, which is a kind of maybe something on this side note. He actually lives very much, the Bey of Damascus gives him the house of Ibn Arabi, which is really symbolic. He lives in the house of Ibn Arabi with all his entourage. Within that timeline, something to put in context. There's two things about how the West really remember and actually honor this figure. The first kind of side of Abd al-Qādir al-Jazāījrī is really his epic resistance. It really completely mesmerized the Western nations, and so they've heard of him as, of course, the British so on, but even as far as America. They heard about this legendary exotic Arabian chief who basically eluded the superpower. Along the military confrontation, remember that as the French colonial, forces are waging a very brutal massacres in Algeria, Abd al-Qādir was winning the battle on a different side. Is his compassionate treatments. He was a very, very a man completely committed to peace and reconciliation. He was absolutely strict, for example, that his soldiers do not harm priests, do not harm any civilian who are settled in Algeria. He was always writing letters with the priest who was commissioned in Algeria. So as things were getting sometimes very, very bloody, Abdul Qadir's legacy was building around. Even the French newsletters were beginning to know about a chief who really exhibits and showcases incredible compassion, and even what we call husn dhan, good opinion even of his enemy, that his intention is really to create a safe haven, and even like maybe create a situation where both the French and the Algerian live together. That's the first side, and then they really documented that. And the second, over time, after he finishes his resistance, probably the second event that really raised him in, as you say, in the podiums globally, was 1862. The Christian Arab Christian Maronites of Damascus live in Damascus for very long, probably centuries, and they are there's like an uprising against the Christians, the Christians of Damascus, by some mobs, like different groups, really basically vengeful reaction to expelling the Christians and so on. So things were really building up and upheaval, and Abd al-Qadir was really sensing that something really catastrophic is going to unfold. And he would send letters to the Bey of Damascus, the Ottoman authorities. You should really intervene. I think this is going to really blow out of proportion. It's going to create chaos. That's exactly what happened. They estimate maybe 6,000 to 10,000 Christians were going basically brutally, killed in the street and so on. And so when the authorities did not intervene, Abd al-Qadir basically confronts the mobs, the part of the kind of the Jewish traditions, like groups of sectarian groups in Damascus. And he really is always like that. He is recognizing that they are kind of semi-attached to the Islamic tradition, try to really discourage them from raising arms and then indiscriminately kill Christians. We got it. So he intervened, first of all, like with his tongue, and everyone, of course, know who al-Qādir was. Tried to really pacify these mobs, and it didn't work. And then when basically they start to violently attack the Maronite Christians of Damascus, Abd al-Qādir basically calls. I mean, now he's like what they call the chief, the ambassadors of the Algerian community in Damascus. A large Algerian is going to be gathered around him. He's like the Ra'is, or the chief. And everyone knows who the Algerians are and how brave and courageous. So he resorts to basically defending them with defending the Christians with his own soldiers, at the cost of possibly even losing his own. So the Algerians gather together under his authority. He bears arms, and he was in Damascus. He owned a very large mansion, and it was paid by both the Ottomans. And then he really packed. Not only did he shelter a lot of European ambassadors, consulars, and so on, but even civilians. He, as much as he could possibly do, they all were sheltered in his house, and it is in hundred, probably quite in the houses of his Algerian counterparts. And he protected them. And then eventually when he is sheltered as many as he can, he walked on these mobs. And because of a lot of people in Damascus feared Abd al-Qādir, he was able to disperse them and to pacify what could have been literally, and some describe it as one of the most imminent massacres in 19th century, was prevented because of his intervention. And then it was, pardon me, as a result of that there was like a shockwave in the world. And you can note today, thankfully, we have still archives in New York's Time, French, French newspaper, Denmark, in Russia. It was such the equivalent of a viral video today. Abd al-Qadir's intervention saves thousands of Christians. He shelters them. He risks his life to protect a religious minority. And so that event really spread, like, as I said, the shockwave. His former adversaries, the French, gave him medals of honor. Queen Victoria, the Tsars of Russia, Spain, almost every head of state in the West, and even, of course, he was also decorated by the Ottoman authorities, one of the highest medal of bravery. And of course, as you mentioned, that news reaches Abraham Lincoln, who actually, we do have the letter that he sends along with the pistols to Abd al-Qādir, and he basically praises Abd al-Qādir as basically as we say, a magnanimous hero of our time. I think there are even, there are so many gifts that still exist today, maybe in museum, that all of these head of states, that really cemented Abd al-Qādir as one of the luminaries in the 19th century, at least in the Western collective kind of history. It completely changed that. And at that time, and of course, he entered into conversation that he never did that for any form of fame. He said that he did this is what my religion commands me to do. This is the honorable gestures that my religion compels me to do. When there's oppression, any oppression of any form and shape, and even against French, I mean, there were French Christians there as well, ambassadors. This was really someone who spoke and who defended value, the intrinsic value that he lived by as a Muslim, as a Sufi, as a saint. And this was, of course, is documented. This is a factual event in all of history. And it also, Henry Churchill, his biographer, also mentions that as a remarkable moment in history.
Amazing. Now moving more onto his contemplative life, one of the things I like to do is actually explore his relationship with Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. From Chodkovich's translations, mainly of the Mawaqif, one sees straight away he's through and through Akbarian, and yet the caliber with which he's discussing some of these Quranic verses is on par, if not exceeds, some of the best commentators on the Fusus, in my humble opinion. It's just written on a very different level. You can see straight away it's almost, he's not commentating conceptually on something, he's living the realities of what he's talking about and unveiling and disclosing them. I mean, it's just phenomenal to see the depth of what he's written. So, but before we delve into that, because you mentioned, obviously, he had this very pious, virtuous upbringing from his father, who must have given him some amazing tarbiyah. And then he meets his sheikh in Mecca, who puts him into retreat. Where does the connection with Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi come in, and what does that look like? And could you tell us about, I believe in his Mawaqif, he does talk about his conversations in the unseen with Sheikh Muhyiddin, and also, correct me if I'm wrong, but initially he was buried next to Sheikh Muhyiddin, and later, I think in 1960 something, or around about that time, the Algerians then requested for his grave to be moved to Algeria, given that he was a national hero. And some say at the time his body was completely intact when it was being moved. So, but it's fascinating. I think it's not spoken much about in terms of his connection with Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi.
Yes, that's the question of Ibn Arabi. I didn't treat it extensively, which inshallah will come on the book. This is going to be turned in the book, if God wills it, maybe by next year. It will really address that in more extensively. That's just how is this kind of what you call supernatural, in a sense, connection with someone who lived almost 800 years before him. There are indications, Michel Shodgowitz in his introduction really documents that extremely well. His connection with Ibn Arabi most likely goes back to his life in Algeria, probably early on when he was before his resistance. Again, maybe it begins even by his father. He's called Muhyiddin, right? This could be one connection. The second connection is with his grandfather, Sidi Mustafa. Sidi Mustafa is grandfather of ʿAbd al-Jazā'irí. According to historical records and what we know a little bit of him, he belonged to al-Qādiri, but also the tradition of Ibn Arabi. He meets Murtada Zabidi, one of the great scholars of the subcontinent in Medina, in Mecca, who actually apparently initiates him directly to kind of the spiritual, traditions of the Akbari tradition. Now, we don't have exact record, like how did Ibn Arabi connect to that? I suspect that Shodgowitz is right, that he already started hearing what Ibn Arabi maybe has read some along in his when he was young with his father. His father most likely spoke about the preeminence of this great Gnostic of the tradition. The second thing is most likely probable. This is also another probable reason I think Shodgowitz mentions it. When they went to Damascus, they did go to Ibn Arabi's shrine, meaning that Ibn Arabi, even when he was very young, was kind of hovering in Abd al-Qadir's mind. Over time, both Michel Shodgowitz and Ala ad-Din Bakri, who actually is the editor of critical edition of Kitab al-Mawaqif, he dug a bit deeper into this. During his imprisonment in France, he mentions Ibn Arabi in passing in a short treatise written by French academics who probably would know nothing about Tasawwuf. But he mentions, because the audience, his connection is most likely during his resistant time. When he was resisting as a political leader, Ibn Arabi must have been one of the figures that, he might have read manuscript. Ibn Arabi's reading was across North Africa, not Middle East, but also in the subcontinent. Impossible that he was not known, especially in Andalus as well. But when he started, his connection must have been reinforced during his spiritual retreat in France when he was imprisoned. And during that lifetime, today we know for sure, today we know that we see this in the critical edition of Ala ad-Din Bakri, that the initial visions, waking vision or dream vision, began when he was in prison in France. And even after his release in France, he has very specific, he documents some vision on his way to London when he has a special reception by the Queen of England. So before he's in Damascus, we know that some mawaqif are written, very few mawaqif. And then Bakri has been able to really give us a longer stretch of how long it took for the mawaqif to be written. Now, it is clear, I think, to me that when he settled in Damascus in the house of Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi is the heartbeat of Tasawwuf in Damascus for 800 years. This is where this really mysterious, unusual, exceptional, rabita connection, bond between a living disciple and someone who died, forges and really intensifies. Ibn Arabi becomes almost the guardian, the kind of a sheikh from beyond of Abd al-Qādir. He sees him right and left and right. Even this is what's so impressive. The visions, waking vision or dream visions of Ibn Arabi seems to be far more than anyone who came after, who actually lived after Ibn Arabi, other than his own disciples who saw him face to face. And so he's writing the commentaries. He's asking Ibn Arabi explanation in his dream visions. This really intensifies in Damascus, and they recognize that there is a hub, an intellectual Sufi Akbarian hub in Damascus, which are really taken back by Abd al-Qadir's like this like exceptional connection with someone 800 years down. And he's, of course, Ibn Arabi considered to be one of the most impactful and influential. So in Damascus, the Rabita becomes intensified. We see it in many chapters of the Mawaqif. And this is, as far as I know, Abd al-Qādir and Abd al-Ghani Nabulsi, it comes up exactly almost century, and he's actually in Damascus between the Palestine and Damascus. Abd al-Ghani Nabulsi is also one of the followers whose initiation is done through Ibn Arabi, from beyond what you call the alam al-khayal, imaginal realm, dream visions. He also, but he doesn't have as many. He doesn't visions or dream visions where Ibn Arabi is kind of shaping. I mean, I have to go to the material as much as Abd al-Qādir. So Damascus is really when Ibn Arabi is kind of really shaping this, maybe I providentially shapes Abd al-Qādir as the foremost proponent of his traditions in the 19th century. And he really is. He becomes the foremost expositors of his teaching. The revival, Akbarian theology is really revived completely, starts spreading far and wide. 19th century to our time, Abd al-Qādir is responsible for, and by the way, Ibn Arabi, Abd al-Qādir is the first one who financed the first edition of Futuhat. When the printing press made it, began to basically function in Egypt. It was so the first edition of Futuhat al-Makkiyah was financed with the money of Abd al-Qādir al-Jazā'irí through a technological device that the West introduced to the Islamic world. And then so on. So he becomes the doctrinal expositors, but also on the terms of scholarship. If we try to retrace this massive global admiration of Ibn Arabi goes back to Abd al-Qādir. So that's where the connection goes. Of course, it's a lot more spiritual because of the visions and but eventually after he meets his sheikh, Abd al-Qādir al-Jazā'irí, is not hiding behind the materials of Ibn Arabi, but he really emerges as a self-realized Gnostic on his own right. About 2/3 of the mawaqif are complete like inspirations from God directly. He doesn't even read he even doesn't read the commentators. That's one of the chapters I wrote in the thesis. His commentary on the Shu'aybi chapter is completely visionary commentary on Ibn Arabi and self-actualized knowledge, which is really one of the unique cases of the commentators of Ibn Arabi who don't consult the previous tradition. That gives us an idea of how significant he is in his spiritual growth and development, right?
That's amazing. That's phenomenal. So let's dive into that a bit more. In the Muwaqif, maybe just beginning with what is the Muwaqif? What does the term mean?
Yes.
For our listeners? As you said, it was written over a period of time. Was it verbally expounded? Did he actually write it? And then also the commentary on the various chapters in the fusus. Does he do the whole fusus, or is it certain chapters? Which chapters does he do? And is it true that Sheikh Muhyiddin, he documents that Sheikh Muhyiddin said none of my commentators has fully understood the intention of the Prophet, not my intention, as in Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi's intention, the intention of the Prophet. And so which chapters of the fusus does he comment on, and would you be able to, have you done some analysis in terms of how it differs from the traditional Akbarian commentary of Qaisari, Jandi, Kashani, that sort of line? Does he bring anything new to the surface? Thank you.
Yes. Well, yes. So there are quite significant portion of the Kitab al-Waqif, in short, the book of mystical way stations. This is the abbreviated version. It really documents pretty much the itinerary, I guess, the itinerary of Abd al-Qādir al-Jazā'irí through his spiritual life or mystical life. So it's called Mawaqif. It's this book. The title also comes back from a Baghdadi Sufi saint, Fanari, who wrote Kitab al-Mawaqif many centuries before him. The shape and the format is a bit different, but they're really quite similar, because even that the Kitab al-Mawaqif of his predecessors, it's really autonomous really like spontaneous mystical intuitions, very little work with sources. Abd al-Qadir is in that sense. I take it to, I see that his Kitab al-Waqif is documenting the spiritual stations of Abd al-Qadir Jazairi, the different spiritual attainments, the milestones, and they are done as if you can see through the full book. It's called Kitab al-Mawaqif fi ba'd isharat al-Quran. So you see, he says the book of Mawaqif fi ba'd isharat al-Quran. This is the book of mystical halts or spiritual station concerning some subtle Quranic allusions to the esoteric mysteries and divine truth. What is so interesting about it really seems like a different version of the Futuhat, because he's going to map doctrine, practice, visions, all the the blueprint of the spirit through the Quran, through the isharat of the Quran, everything that the saints and the Gnostic actualizes in terms of ma'rifah, intimate knowledge of God. It's the best medium or matrix of that is the Quran, and that's how he said Kitab al-Mawaqif fi ba'd isharat al-Quran. So that's why he uses that, and those isharat are his. They are, and you see that maybe in the thesis I engage with that. It is particular things that happens to him, and eventually he's got a really remarkable ecstatic experience where God he's kind of taking away from his self-consciousness, and he sees these Quranic verses and so on. He brings them back to an event or a question he had. It's almost like conversing with God. So it's very personal. It's very personal how he convinced. Now, in terms of this is actually very much how Futuhat is. Ibn Arabi always speaks about none of what I wrote is is based on the experience or the writing of someone else. Sometimes they summarizes, but is embedded in direct ilham, inspiration. Same thing. The commentary, the sharh of he has a long sharh on the 12th chapter of Fusus. He has a sharh on the chapter of Ismail of the Fusus al-Hikam. He has also a kind of intermittent chapter commentary on the Fusus of Adam alayhi salam, and of course a commentary on the chapter on the Holy Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. So as far as I know, the Ismail chapter and even the Shu'aib are the longest commentary in the Fusus tradition. There's even Qunawi, the direct disciple of Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, did not write a lot. Is almost all the commentaries of Ibn Arabi are longer than any of his predecessors. He does not have a complete commentary on the Fusus. I take it to be the reason because of that. He is a commentator, but he's not perceiving himself as just merely a commentator. I'm just coming here like as just to comment word by word. It's more about how the commentary fits into his own mystical experiences and his own ma'rifah, intimate knowledge. But when he gets into, for example, the chapter of Shu'aib, I think it's the longest, close to 60, maybe 70 pages. There's no contemporary or classic commentary. Ismail too. So he has these two long chapters, and then in the Mawaqif you will always see the other chapters coming, whether they occupy one doctrine, but not like for example Qaisari and Jendi, like word by word, etymologically and so on. He just fits them right into the Kitab al-Mawaqif. That's how he fits into the commentarial tradition. And his commentary tends to be very, autonomous, independent. You will not see Qaisari's and begin with like etymology, and then he goes into the Ash'ari understanding, and then the Hukama, the Falasifas, very word by word, like what they call musalsal commentary. Abd al-Qādir seems to me he already has a really broad training in all the disciplines. Qur'ani, the exoteric tafsir, he knows. He was actually an accomplished Ash'ari theologian. He is a Maliki Mufti. He's a remarkable grammarian. He's one of the most eloquent, rhetorician of his time. He's like a master of the Arabic language, poetry. So So he brings all of that into his, scholarship. But when he's writing the commentaries, it does not come through the commentaries of someone else. It seems like he's just either it's a combinations of what Ibn Arabi, as you said, in the chapter of Shu'aib and even the chapter of Ismail, Ibn Arabi does tell him in his dream vision or wakeful vision that he's the only one who really deciphered the true intent. Not to say that Qanawi did not, but Abd al-Qādir really went so much deeper. Maybe you could say the closest that you can get to the true intention, the top of the prophetic, science that was transmitted to Ibn Arabi. So this is documented. This is reproduced in Kitab al-Mawaqif, that Ibn Arabi does tell him that, and then it actually is told to the vision, because Abd al-Qādir goes to the door where the door is locked, but the key is inside, and somehow he's able to open it, and then when very paradoxical, the key to the door of the chapter on Shu'aib is inside the house. And then he understands, he has a remarkable way of deciphering what the dreams tells him. And one of them was that Ibn Arabi clearly tells him, you're the only one to do that. So it's really like what you call sui generis, very unique, that Abd al-Qādir writes commentaries, but purely from his own metaphysical, knowledge, his own self-realized knowledge. Typically, not that he doesn't bring the other scholarship, but when I read him commenting on the Ismail chapter, on the Muhammadan chapter, the Adamic chapter, he does one thing. He's really good how he brings in the underlying sources, like which Quranic verses and hadith, very vast. The breadth of his knowledge is remarkable. He will bring a lot of things that Ibn Arabi doesn't say, because he expects his readers to already know that. So when I read the chapter on Shu'aib, Abd al-Qādir is going to go on tangents. And on that tangent, he's gonna bring all these hidden sources that are. But this is how the classically trained commentator read it, because they already have the matrix of Akbarian knowledge already in their heads. They know the tradition, they know the Quranic references. So he does that, and it really kind of magnifies the commentary. It becomes large. Like sometimes just the word think. He's gonna go to thingness. He's gonna go gods. There's nothing like God, and then he's gonna bring how Ibn Arabi has this in mind. But then he's gonna just start on shay, and he's gonna be a whole myriad of commentary just on the nature of thingness from the Quranic perspective. So, but he does it autonomously. You don't read like Qaisari. Like Qaisari might even bring others commentary, and this, I guess, every commentary has kind of this adopted very unique way of reading, and also unfolding and revealing what Ibn Arabi is trying to say. The gist of it, yeah.
That's amazing. And so could you just maybe, while we're on this topic, just say a bit about his engagement? Does he talk about his engagement with Ibn Arabi? Does he sit and have visionary sort of durus with the Shaykh and have him teach these chapters? Did he receive the teachings directly from Shaykh Ibn Arabi, for example? And by extension, you mentioned Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, who wrote his own brilliant commentary. How does that, but what, as you said, was initiated in the unseen through the Shaykh al-Akbar. Does that have any resonance in terms of how they are exploring the fusus, or does Amir Abdul Qadir have a different sort of uptake, a different understanding of these chapters?
Yes, I mean the Mawaqif. The Mawaqif has quite a sizable number of citation where Abd al-Qadir just tells the audience how the interaction with Ibn Arabi transpired, and so sometimes, for example, in very short snippets, but he doesn't go on to say that, as far as I know, there isn't one wakeful vision or dream vision where the entirety of, for example, a chapter is discussed. There are really there are absolutely, he mentioned dialogues. He asked Ibn Arabi sometimes something very complex, only those things that he really cannot really, grapple with. And he meets Ibn Arabi in the scene, and Ibn Arabi tells him this is what it is. And he literally transmits to him the accurate knowledge. Other times, for example, the Chat of Ismail, he speaks about how Ibn Arabi is telling him, this is what my commentary missed, and I'm gonna, this is what it means. So it's really, it's pervasive how you see it throughout the chapters. Every time he speaks Ibn Arabi, often it's like a prelude or prefaced by, I saw him there and there, and we had this dialogue, and it's quite remarkable. But it doesn't it doesn't probably go more than 2 paragraphs or maybe 1 paragraph. Just give the kind of visionary context, just to consolidate, or his authority to his audience, because how many commentators, how many people around him can have this privilege of seeing the actual author in the scene and coming back with validity, validating that with the scene. And they, of course, they believed him because they saw him as a Arif, as a saintly man. And it really, this was, I think that it really it took them really by surprise. A lot of the scholars, Sufi scholars of Damascus, that they were really jarred by the idea that someone alive is having this dialogue of the scene with someone the most venerable person in Damascus. They see him every day. It really shaped Damascus since his death. This is absolutely there. But I think because of the nature of how he's writing his material, he tends to maybe give us just like, often it's always the preface of a chapter, a prelude. Oh, Ibn Arabi came to me and he explained, you know what I mean? And we saw each other. Or I saw Ibn Arabi's in the shape of a lion, but I knew it was him. And he had like a huge chain in his mouth, and then he told me to grab the chain, right? And when he grabbed, and I was scared of grabbing the chain, but then I trusted him. When I put my hand inside his mouth, but not, and when he comes back from that vision, the chain represents the Sharia. That Ibn Arabi told him, he was very disappointed with some of how the Sufi are, kind of start to deviate from the foundation of the path, which is the Sharia, right? So. And then him holding on to the chain of the lion being like in the imaginal form, the scene, like Ibn Arabi meant to al-Qādir him that he is actually sticking very close to ma'rifah, but also what do you call tariq, sharia and haqiqah, right? So you have that, like even al-Qādir is going to give you examples of how Ibn Arabi appears to him in different shapes and so on. It's part of the tradition, but once he writes his commentary, they really like Ābd al-Ghani commentary. I think is a complete one. He also documents a clear and remarkable vision of Ibn Ābd al-Ghani Nabulsi, where he sees Ibn Arabi and he holds him. Ābd al-Ghani Nabulsi appears as a child, as an infant being breastfed by Ibn Arabi, in a sense, which is like remarkable. And this was the initiation, complete initiation of and he was very young. This marked the breakthrough in his spiritual fath or opening. They are quite similar. Ābd al-Ghani Nabulsi, because wanting to add, both Ābd al-Ghani and Ābd al-Qādir, they both explicitly speak of their spiritual station. One spoke of being one of Ābd al-Ghani Nabulsi. Despite deep reverence for Ibn Arabi, he said that he is one of the seals of his time. That Ābd al-Ghani says, I am one of the seals of this time. Abdul Qadir al-Jazā'irí speaks clearly about a vision where he actually sees that he was giving glad tidings that he became one of the substitute of the spiritual pole. He said it was during the vision he saw his mother, and then she who actually passed on. And she gives him the news that he became now one of what they call in the typology of saints, the Abdal, the 4 kind of poles, that they form circle, the 4 basically pillars that are that serve the pole of his time. And he says, I have been invested with that. Ābd al-Qadir says it explicitly, and even Ābd al-Ghani speaks actually of even a higher, I believe, like being a khatm is quite a magnificent station. So they are very similar in that sense. I mean, we know that Qunawi doesn't. I don't think he speaks about that. He definitely speaks of being, having, attained the furthest most station of realization. But he doesn't speak about where do you fit into the hierarchy of saints, or maybe Qaisari. But Ābd al-Ghani and they both explicitly say, yes, they are followers, but also they belong to the real, living typology and hierarchy of saints. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. And so I was wondering if you can maybe read to us from the original Arabic of the Muwaqif some passage you open to your choice, and maybe explain a bit and expound, and maybe the context, maybe part of that is maybe as a separate question, or maybe you would want to answer the question in by citing from the Muwaqif, is because you mentioned the Quran and the way Amīr al-Qādir is bringing out these isharat, and I know with Sheikh Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, he plays on the etymology of words, and so there's never a fixed meaning. There's multiple variations of meaning, as long as it's valid within the literal form and within the grammatical syntax. He's able to bring out the amazing, highest metaphysical understanding just through small syntax of grammar and that sort of thing. So how does, in terms of Quranic exegesis, what is Sheikh Abdul Qadir's perspective in this tradition, and how does he then expound on these isharat?
Yes. So yeah, in terms of the tradition, he is both trained in two perspectives. The first perspective, obviously, when he was young, he was introduced by his father and his teacher. He had many teachers in philology, Arabic grammar, the introduction to Asbab al-Nuzul. He knows all of that. He read the Tafsir Jalalain. He read the Tafsir of Tabari. All of this material comes along. Tafsir of Fakhruddin al-Razi, philosophical tafsir, Zamakhraji. This is like the foundational training. He speaks obviously of all the what you call the Tafsir al-Amma, right? The Tafsir. And here I'm gonna pull up this maybe. Okay. To just give you an indication of how he navigates the two perspectives. I have a few. Unfortunately, I don't have here in my office the Arabic thing, but I think I can remember at least the broad kind of sentences. But let me just bring you to this. Where is it? If you can, okay. So let me, since I have it here, so he says, for example, in one of his, this is a direct quotation in my dissertation, the folks of our way, i.e. the Sufis, may God be pleased with them, never claimed to bring something new in matters of religious conviction, but merely affirmed that they beheld a new comprehension, fahmun jadid, of certain revealed truth of the faith. They found support of this claim in the report saying that a man intelligence is not perfected until he discerns the countless faces of the Quran. And in the other report, which stated the Quran has a back, a dahr, a belly, a button, a limit, a had, and a transcendental point, matla'. Ibn Habban report this in his authentic collection. So this is like an excerpt of trying to give the audience, very common how the Sufis do it. Even Ibn Arabi, even Sulami in his Lata'if, and Qushayri, they typically try to always affirm the exoteric, the literal meaning has a foundational place in exegesis, even for the Sufis. No Sufis says that what I am bringing through illusion, and we will maybe see what an illusion does. An illusion never contradicts the literal meanings of the Quran, which has its own place. And he speaks of these reports, hadith report, literally from the hadith, that the Quran has a back, a dahr, like literally, dahr literally is a back, and then you have a belly button. Some of the translators would put it back like an outward, a belly, an inward, a limit, which is a had, The limit has typically been understood like the ahkam, the rules of the Quran, like literally what is the moral injunctions of the Quran. There's nothing about them that you can change. It's like, and then the matla, something like a transcendental meaning that is within the letter. So he mentioned that very clearly, that the Sufis are not claiming to bring something new. They are speaking about 4 intelligible domains, 4 different dimensions that are actually explicitly mentioned in the Quran and sorry, in the Hadith. And he mentioned the authentic narration, citation of Ibn Habban, one of the collectors of Hadith. So he speaks about all of these are simultaneous dimension, exoteric, inward or exoteric, esoteric, limit, and so on. The Sufis are going to speak about the depth. What is it in the Quranic narratives or the Quranic text that is directly and intimately connected to an insight, a deeper insight in the path, the spiritual wayfaring of the mufassir or the exegete. So this is how he typically frames when he speaks about his tafsir. He always frames it in connection, in the context of how it fits within both the exoteric but also the Sufi exoteric tradition. So that's one perspective. Then when it comes to how does someone like Ibn Arabi, in his time, in his life and time, ʿAbd al-Jazāījī, Abu Qasim al-Qushayri, Sulami, even Tustari, all these, how does it fits that in every cycle of history, every time there has to be a new meaning, unique, because of this what they call intelligible plenitude, this kind of outflow of meaning that are extracted from the Quran at every single moment. This is an infinite speech of God. So he says, Abdul Qadir kind of gives us an idea of how this fits. Abdul Qadir reinforces this distinction by quoting a statement Sufi attribute to Ali ibn Abi Talib about the spiritual science that the Prophet ﷺ bequeathed to his household Ahlul Bayt, meaning Ali, Fatima, Hassan al-Hussein. I quote, I open the quote. There is in the sound narration which mentioned that Ali, may Allah ennoble his face, was once asked, did the Messenger of God ﷺ transmit to you his household Ahlul Bayt a science that has not been bestowed on others? To which Ali replied, no, by him who has split the seed and created the breath of life, we have nothing else save a deeper comprehension. Fahman, is it the deeper comprehension of God's book, which he inspires to a man, and what is found in this scroll, Sahifa, like the Mus'haf. You must know that what is found in these mawaqif is of this order, and God speaks the truth and guide us to the right path. This is another he gives you that this specific narration from Ali that I gave you, that the Ahlul Bayt inherited a spiritual science. What is fahm jadid, or a deeper comprehension of the Quran? This is a spiritual science transmitted to Ahlul Bayt. And he says, Abdul Qadir, and you must know, O reader, that what is found in these mawaqif is of this order, and God speaks the truth and guide us to the right path. So this is where he specifically and explicitly speaks about his own mystical hermeneutics being directly embedded in divine inspiration. He said, everything you read that I interpret in this mawaqif are of this order, of this nature. So this also gives us another perspective. Now he does get into the last kind of quote, where it tells you that this is what is it exactly? What is this type of mystical hermeneutics that is unique to Abd al-Qādir and even Ibn Arabi has exactly the same perspective when it comes to how the Quranic verses are inspired directly to them, how they come up with this new deeper meaning that have never been, kind of expressed by someone before them. We spoke about how he kind of envisioned or frames the scriptural or hermeneutics of the Sufi within this, hadith tradition of the four levels of, or the fourfold levels of the Quran. Then he actually brings another narrations from Ali ibn Abi Talib about this basically science that really is inherited directly and even uniquely to Ahlul Bayt, the household of the Prophet, which has to do with a deeper comprehension of the Quran. And then Abd al-Qādir then gives us explicit statement here about just what is this modality: divine projection, ilqa, and scriptural allusion, which is one of the terminology we encounter in many Sufi texts. So we see here, I'm going to just quote this. He speaks about this mystical hermeneutics and how really it transpires for him as a mystical exegetes. He says, for example, in terms of this Quranic verse, you have in the emissary of God the most excellent model. This is what he says about the transcendental source of his mystical exegesis. I quote, I have received this verse through a transcendental divine projection, تلقيا غيبيا روحانيا, for whenever God commands me, prohibits me, delights me, warns me, when he has something to teach me, or when I beseech him for an answer to a problem that preoccupies me, he strips me from my self-awareness, يأخذني عني, while keeping my physical form intact. He then casts into me, or projects, يلقي إلي, on what he casts onto me or on me what he intends with an ishara, an allusion to a noble verse of the Quran. So this is gives us like a really first-hand perspective of how Abd literally this kind of process. I just wanted to stop presenting. Yeah, there you go. A very intimate process of what really transpires for a mystics going through, receiving the ilqa, projection, mystical inspiration of a verse. But you see how he frames it. When he has an inquiry, a prayer, a petition, anything, a commandment, it's always, it comes to him, it's divinely projected through a verse. And this is what he called ilqa, and then ilqa brings with it an illusion, through an illusion or an ishara, as the Sufi say. So this is like one of several instances. It's plenty of them in Kitab al-Mawaqif. Actually, 2/3 of the Mawaqif is just mystical hermeneutics. This makes mystical interpretation of basically select verses, sometimes short verses, sometimes longer, and that's how Abd al-Qādir frames it.
Amazing. Phenomenal. As we're approaching the end of the podcast, probably just a couple of things to tie up the podcast. One is just to see if Sheikh Abd al-Qādir resolves any problems for the modern person in the contemporary world in his Mawaqif. And maybe I'll just bullet point some, and maybe if there's others you think are worth highlighting, that he really resolves this in a really beautiful, excellent manner. So one is, for example, the discussion, the understanding around what you alluded to earlier, the relationship between Sharia, Tariqah, and Haqiqah. And there's various perspectives on that, and I think there's also perspectives on what is Sharia. It's a word that's sort of used, without really understanding maybe some of the metaphysical dimensions of what the Sharia entails. And often people use it in terms of usul of fiqh, and they use the term Sharia for that, whereas fiqh is fiqh and Sharia is Sharia. So, so one is that. The second maybe is the relationship. So this is just problems for the seeker, if you like, or points where people have different perspectives, especially in the modern world. So I think there's also the idea around the relationship between the aql and the qalb, And we know
Yes.
Martin Lings, for example, talks about the intellectus, the higher, the intellect in the true sense of the word, being a faculty which perceives the transcendent, not in a modernist, rationalistic sense of, say, an academic intellectual. But at the same time, we have a big influx of spiritual practice, not just ideas, but practice of abstaining from thought. In the modern world, I'm talking about with mindfulness movement, with the influence of Zen Buddhism, of emptying the mind. And it's almost like there's paths which stress it's all about the heart, and so we
Yes.
leave the mind. But at the same time, we see in Amīr al-Qādir al-Jazāଈrī, somebody who's thinking is grounded, it's rooted in the Quranic Akbarian perspective. He's able to bring out these isharat. So that to me is quite very interesting, is how one's thinking in the modern era can be shaped or grounded, not just on the level of conditioning, religious conditioning, but one which has the vertical dimension imbued in it. But some parts seem to separate that. In some Sufis sometimes talk about this Zen Buddhist approach, almost, of completely abstaining from thought and going through dhawq, but in that process they're divorcing the intellect from the heart. And so Amīr al-Qādir seems to be taking it, correct me if I'm wrong, he synthesizes this approach where the intellect is subservient to the high intelligence of the heart. But I wonder if he's just talking about that somewhere. So those are two things that I've come up with. And then maybe if there's anything on critiques around Ibn Arabi. I know as many people follow him, there's also people who misunderstand him, and whether he addresses them. I know the great Sheikh Alawi of Algeria also spent time addressing criticisms on tasawwuf and correcting, and that's writing letters, to maybe to avoid misunderstandings, and whether he has anything on that. So those are just a couple of things that I think would be worth exploring if he talks about them. But if there's any other problems that you think he addresses, it would be great to sort of hear from him.
Yes. So to begin with, this is actually quite I guess, a capital issue to address. We speak often in Tasawwuf, and especially Tasawwuf Ibn Arabi, al-Qādir, too often of doctrines, but we forget really the foundations of these traditions. I don't know of any credible Sufi saint scholars who undermine the importance of Sharia, and this, by which I'm in the simplest term, instead of getting into like kind of too details into the fiqh tradition and this usul, when they speak about the Sufis, and not only the Sufi, even the jurist, the Sharia, we are speaking first and foremost about ahkam. These ahkam are the rulings, the practical rulings that are basically enjoined on Muslims and prescribed, right? And not only what to do, there is a moral code in the Quran by which Muslims live. This moral code was established through revelation, not by any human endeavor, but to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet himself was the Sharia. That's why they call him the Sharia, the legislator. So this is very important to that, for why we would call the Prophet the Sharia, the legislator, because not only does he convey the practical ruling, the moral code, ethical code of the Quran. This pertains to not only there's the practical side of prescription, the religious prescription, without which you cannot claim, for example, being a Muslim. For example, like the 5 pillars of Islam. If you really, these are the criteria of commitment to the moral code, and then you have the Sharia gives you a moral code for human interactions. It gives you a moral code for even interaction with other species. There's a whole moral code that governs the lives of Muslims, whether they are what they call lay followers, whether they are scholars of fiqh or philosophers, hukama, or they are Sufis. So the Sharia is something over which there is no dispute. You cannot this is one insight or principle that all the Sufis to this day, even when you have deviation in Sufi traditions or groups, which is absolutely the case in every other group, the consensus: you cannot engage in the spiritual path without compliance with the Sharia. It is simply impossible to have a path into knowing. Again, this whole purpose is to know God, and you have to, in order to know Him, you have to first do what He tells you, because that's part of how you know Him. You know what I mean? That's how. So the consensus, ʿAbd al-Qādir al-Jazāījī is so clear about that. And one of the things that really kind of eluded his contemporary, including those who are critical of the Sufi tradition, is that ʿAbd al-Qādir al-Jazāījī was always performing his prayers at all his prayers all the time. He was a man who was engaging, what they call night vigil, incredibly highly ethical man on all fronts. So on the Sharia front, and he's also Mufti. He actually was a Mufti. The Sharia speaks about the rulings, the moral code. Now, you can't tread the path according to all the Sufis without, first of all, the implementations of the moral code of this faith. Once you have a implementation, the Sharia, then you start walking the path. Now the path, this is where things become a little bit subtle. When we say walking the path in the Sufi tradition, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir says that, and that's why, just take that as an example. Why would someone at the age of 50, Abdul Qadir, probably one of the most accomplished men in Islamic history, take the path at the age of 50 with a incognito Sufi sheikh that no one knew? He was a major Sufi, Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi, but it actually really perplexed his friends. They told him, how would someone who has already attained, they call him, this is min ajaibu zaman. They says his cousin wrote a letter to Abdul Qadir in Mecca. He said, this is one of the marvels of the century. How could someone like you, who has already attained self-realization, ma'rifah, go and take hands with another sheikh? But the Abdul Qadir al-Jazāījī is so adamant, and I have the quote in my teaching: you cannot complete your the spiritual path without a credible sheikh who has the function of irshad, of someone who actually has the function of guiding you to the path, to the difference. Even if you have ma'rifah before that, when you are under the guidance of a verified, someone who has a silsila, a sheikh, this is where the complete wayfaring really transpires, and is the highest form of realization. So Sharia is one thing, and then he, even for himself, at the age of 50, he decided to become the disciple of Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi, someone who's also Sharif and also part of the Qawiyya. That is when Abdul Qadir al-Jazāījī speaks about, after his teacher to put him to the practices, the awrad, the litanies of the Shadiliyya. It is under the supervision of this sheikh in Ghar Hira that Abdul Qadir achieves, like his son tells us, al-Fath al-Nurani, the supreme luminous opening. And the first qasida is dedicated to Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi, that it was at the hands of his sheikh that the opening happened. So the Sharia has always been part of his life. And then the what is it called, the path, the tariqah, is about the ego. The sheikh is there because you cannot objectively cultivate your own self. This is when the spiritual physician and the sheikh and the guide, the credible, comes along. The ego, someone can actually spend a lifetime practicing the rites of Islam and do it with an incredibly overbearing ego. That is something God is going to reward your prayers and hajj and all these things, but the ego is something very different than just implementation of the practice. The ego is almost, as you grow up, the ego becomes your identity. So that's why you cannot see it. You cannot objectively see your vices in the blind spot. And even when you are morally refined, you have akhlaq. The ego sometimes is not even about akhlaq. is about like it's literally an opening into the deepest secret of the soul, the ruh. And this someone can be ethically upright, but they don't know who they are. They don't really know who they really are. They don't know the nafkha, the spiritual inblowing of God. What is this thing in me? So when you are treading the path, doing the wayfaring with a spiritual guide like al-Qādir himself did, this could be your spiritual breakthrough. You know why you're born, you know who you are, you know where you're going, you know about the afterlife, you know truly the story that God wanted to read with you and for you. This happens through someone who can work with you on the path. So Sharia, tariqah, you are walking, you are treading the path, and eventually through practice you cannot attain. This is very important. Without the basic compulsory prescription of the Sharia, without the litanies, the awrad of a sheikh. These litanies go back from sheikh to disciple to Ali ibn Abi Talib, from Ali to the Prophet. These are initiatory litanies. They might not be 50,000 things to say. They might be a rite or a litany from someone who has the function, the initiatory function to pass this down to you. They received it interruptedly in a broken line from their sheikh to Ali to the Prophet. That 15-20 minutes that you do a litany with an authentic sheikh, this is the opening. Is through them, this litany. And when you break through the litany, you have broken the allegiance, the bond that actually connects you directly to the Prophet. It's like the direct shortcut to the prophetic spirit in many respects, all this silsila. And so practice it as dhikr, as the shuyukh says, even the Quran says, and this is really answer the questions. The Sufis don't have the idea of just fikr. It's always dhikr. And dhikr is always the preface, dhikr and then fikr. So you have the dhikr, which is the remembrance, the recollection of God through the practices, to the Islamic prescriptions, and the kind of the practice you take from the sheikh. And fikr, contemplation, comes with dhikr. It doesn't come. Like actually a contemporary sheikh, my own personal sheikh, says, fikr without dhikr is blasphemy, and dhikr without fikr is it's like a frozen. It's like a stagnation. Dhikr without fikr is stagnation. Fikr without dhikr is blasphemy. Because the only way for the inner spirit to be open, for the inner heart to be open, what they call the ruh or the qalb, different terminology for sometimes the one thing, it is through this initiatory practices that cultivate, they not only cleanse the vices, but they also refine your body. The body goes through a refinement, physical, psychic, spiritual refinement, in order for you to reach the center of yourself, the center which is the ruh. And so when it is through that you can enter that, what you call the point of contact with God, the dhikr is that tread. You tread the path with the dhikr, and then it's simultaneous. That's why you don't have a similar practice where you empty the mind, but you can actually fill it with something that'd be much worse. So the mind itself could be an egotistical mind, a mind that the shell of the mind is so closing your eyes and contemplating. You cannot vacate the mind with something that has no efficacy. We say it has to be something that starts dissipating the cloud, like one of the teachers says. Your mind is actually a dark mass. The ego is a dark mass, and so you have to have a silsila, an authenticated, credible a sanad or a practice that comes from a prophetic figure. That's the only remedy. So sitting in a forest without any, like, it's like holding on to some luggage that really get, the survival luggage, the kit to survive is the dhikr. Instead of vacating, you actually are absorbing the most nefarious things outside of you, but also inside of you. Because when you vacate, it could be that it is the satanic whispers. It could be the for example, the jinni forces. and other forces that actually completely dominate and consume your mind, because those forces can only be repelled with something luminous, something that can be traced back to. It's as we said, the Prophet transmit to Ahl al-Bayt luminosity, complete luminosity. It's not you, it doesn't belong to you. It comes from God. The silsila is God, Gabriel, the Prophet, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, Hussein, and that is an untouchable, invincible luminosity. You cannot even replace it by reading. Reading is insufficient. So there is like what you call treading and walking the path and running through the mud. And so when that is done, then you have the third stage, which is haqiqah. When you are able to combine fikr and dhikr, then the last path, the last station, the milestone is when the guide tells you, here you are, you and your Lord, and that's haqiqah. That's where you really know who you are and you know who God is. And God makes you know who you are. And that's the last. This is the ultimate basically quest, the ultimate big questions of every human being, and those of course of mystical temperament, whether in Islam, Sufism. Again, I know that in the Zen tradition as well, they have that an authentic tradition that can also, but the ultimate thing is how do you get there, right? And that's Abdul Qadir sees it in this way, in the same respect. I don't know if I missed any other.
No, that's amazing. So just to summarize, for listeners, if I've understood correctly, the zikr and the fikr. The zikr represents the vertical sort of dimension, the spiritual dimension of transcendence and eminence, that practice. And then the fikr is more on the horizontal, so it's informing the thought. And so we're saying that if you don't have zikr, if you don't have remembrance, then your fikr, your thought, your contemplation is quite limited, or it's blasphemy, whatever, however you want to term that. And the inverse is also true. If you're just doing remembrance without cultivating your thought or having it infused, again, that's an imbalance. And so, but the primary is you need your zikr in order to, it's almost what we spoke about earlier of the active and passive dimensions of the spiritual warrior. You need both in balance, with the spiritual being like the center, the pole, if you like, around which everything else revolves. Exactly.
That really sums it up well. I mean, in any ways, in whatever way you put it, whether one is a vertical or is horizontal, the point is the synthesization of it. You synthesize it. There is no. It's the synthesization of it really is where basically self-fulfillment or self-realization occurs, at least in the Islamic Sufi tradition. And Abdul Qadir is definitely part of this tradition. He was a very intensively, he was engaged in a lot of spiritual, practice from the beginning. I mean, very young age, but also when he was in Mecca for a year and a half, it was a very long spiritual retreat. And he speaks about his litanies and his dhikr and so on. And eventually he has a major opening. And just to kind of go on one thing that's really important, maybe we don't want to take too much time. Aside from that, you mentioned the idea of modernity and colonialism for al-Qādir al-Jazā'irí. It's interesting because one of the things that I try to bring in the research is that Abdul Qādir al-Jazā'irí is really acutely aware of an imminent danger in the Islamic intellectual tradition, and one of them is what I call the subversive side of rationalism, even in Islam. And so it was very important when he was speaking of critique. Abdul Qadir al-Jazā'irí, many of things that he writes about, he defends Ibn Arabi left and right. He really believed that this is a genuine and the soundest epistemology for any time and age. And especially I sensed it because he witnessed the dramatic changes of Islamic societies and traditions in the 19th century. He saw the technological innovations of Europe, but also the degradation of European traditions, religious and intellectual. It was very important that when he picked up his pen, he was writing as an Akbarian, he was really trying to warn his own community. He was far more concerned with the Islamic tradition than West. He was warning the jurist and the Ash'ari and other intellectual community within the tradition to not fall prey to excessive rationalism. That is the pitfall of any sound tradition, that the Sufi epistemology can recognize the different degrees of knowledge, that things have their place. Even grammar has a place, even philology and so on. So is jurism, fiqh. Sufism is not about dismissing. It recognizes certain hierarchy of knowledge, and they are in place for a reason. You need jurists for this kind of unifying body of knowledge, unifying epistemology. But the danger of colonial modernity, or what you call the discourse of colonial modernity, which is so centered on the glorification of rationalism, was if that sort of glorification intruded into Islamic tradition, it would be catastrophic. You needed an epistemology that is like the Sufi epistemology, that is experiential. That's one thing, but it's also surprisingly paradoxical. It's that it literally challenges the kind of the logical, rational, linear thinking of the mind, because one of the revelations of Sufism is that God through opposites. And that's why he has 99 names, and one of them they seem to be contrary to the other, right? The one who benefits and the one who harms. And so one of the key breakthroughs in Sufi epistemology is to recognize an epistemology that transcends linear scientific knowledge, because God is not an object, is not a thing, it's not something you can actually put in a lab and understand. One of the key things about something as remarkable as incomprehensible as God, and the limited reality, it's the disclosures of God, the way that his knowledge is going to stand above the threshold of what we have of concept of. And so it's important to recognize, this is very simple. Prophetic knowledge is not rational. You cannot rationally become a prophet. So there is a threshold, and this was very important for al-Qādir, that the Muslim tradition recognized that the Sufis were guardian and protecting an incredibly important inheritance or legacy of prophetic knowledge, which is not the denial of reason, but it's an affirmation that reason is insufficient. If reason alone was sufficient, there was no need for prophecy at all. And so an epistemology very much close to, we could say, put it this way, the Vedantic Hindu tradition, non-dualism, a perception or a realization of absolute unity in the midst of incredibly complex and diverse universe and world, can only be penetrated through like this deeper, like I call it in the heart intellect, or intellective heart. It has a contemplative, but it also has like this. The heart is really the center of unification. A very unifying epistemology comes out. So he was very, very prudent and very aware of that, and he is really, really critical of the rationalism of Ash'ari tradition. This is one of the things that really sets him apart from any reformers of his time, that you still need, and it's absolutely capital, that Sufi epistemology remains validated, and also and of course a response, a valuable response, one of the only response, a metaphysical response to a scientifically materialistic European epistemology, would come directly from the Sufi tradition. So this was just to add to the short note that this was a fundamental for me finding in my research of al-Qādir as an Akbarian.
And can you just tell us about his spiritual practice and the principles around that? So you mentioned the wird of the Shadhiliyah,
Yes.
and would he be doing the wazifa of the Shadhiliyah tariqa of Ibn Mashish, for example, and also the principle in the Shadhiliyah around al-ism huwa al-musamma, the name is the name. You mentioned about non-duality, and so the center of, say, invocation of the divine name, and by extension, do we know what he says about the divine names?
Yes, yes. I mean, as far as as I'm concerned, I think that he definitely adopted the standard Darqawi word litany, which is still at the practice today. It's typically consists of 4 elements: 100 times istighfar, 100 times sending blessing salawat on the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and then 100 times the shahada la ilallah wahdahu la sharika lahu al-mulku wa al-hamdu ala kulli shay'in qadir. And then sometimes there are some iterations. Sometimes I'm not sure if this was part of al-Qādir's al-Jazāଈrī, but the fourth iteration is 100 times alhamdulillah wa shukrullah. We know this is Darqawi, one of the Darqawi litanies in Shadili that goes with Abu Hassan Shadili and his successor. And the second, maybe this is the kind of the daily litany, but the name of God, the supreme God, name of God, al-Ism al-A'zam, he speaks directly of that. He speaks of engaging, of being initiated into the invocation of the supreme name of God, which is Allah. As the Sufis believe that Allah is the supreme name that basically synthesizes all the divine names of God, and that is the direct path to realization. Abdul Qadir mentions in Kitab al-Mawaqif that he was engaged in the invocation of the supreme name when he had his supreme opening in Ghar Hira, or the cave of Hira, and he subscribes to the same doctrine that Ibn Arabi, al-Ghazali, that the name of God is God. Al-Ismu huwa al-Musamma, and this is a basic doctrine that he subscribes to. Again, this idea of the Ism al-Musamma we speak about theoretically. Is what do we mean? I mean, he has a whole. I actually have a short paragraph. I mean, a little bit longer actually, on his Shu'aibi commentary of Fusus, where he speaks about a different perspective of what does it mean that the names of God are God. They are identical, identification of the name. He goes on and on and on, but then he one of the concluding remark is that it's a really mysterious reality to experience what it means. The name is the named. This is not the name that we write on the board, or like you have a name, or the name that you're saying is the name God, Allah. Allah, no, this is the utterance is not, but fundamentally the realization in the path seems to be for all these Urafa, is that it is an all-encompassing reality that is not divisible. That when you say the name of God is not, the name is the reality of God. It's the same. And so for disciples it is one of the last stages of realization. But for it, you could say the whole path of a disciple is to kind of walk through the different path, the different manifestations of what the name is, because even the litanies are helping you to really understand the supreme reality. The litany is going to kind of pave the way, but the supreme opening is when you realize the reality is itself, the name of the reality is the reality. And so that is something that he subscribes to. He speaks about the Ism al-Mu'azzam al-Maknoon. It is the supreme concealed name. It is concealed. Its reality, it's all encompassing, is concealed. And it is only that reality that exists. And this is a whole controversy. The idea of the doctrine of the oneness of existence is different to speak about it from perspective of someone who realized, from then the perspective of a disciple who is treading the path on. He's actually my sheikh says that's the practice. The whole wayfaring is through the name. The name is infinitely disclosed. It's even after death. Even after death, you still, depending on the level of realization, this whole plot of God, of the Supreme, is through His name, from non-beginningless to endlessness. It's all because the name is not conceptual. It is not doctrine. It is not even what it transcends even all the orders of the cosmos. The seven heavens are not even a drop of the reality of the name. So the name is everything, is all thing, right? And really what comes so close to is really the Vedanta tradition, right? It really gets it right. And then when you have that realization, you are that, thou art that. There's only that, right? And so, but I only can speak about for Abd al-Qadir Jazāଈrī. He says that's what under the hand of Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi. That reality, he never had access to that reality before that. And that, so, but to answer in short, he would agree with Ghazali and that this idea that yeah, it's all identical. The name is identical with the name and so on. This is a basic doctrine. The way they express it would be very different from Ash'arism, very different from the Mu'tazila theologian, very different from the jurist, and so on.
We spoke about the connection of Sheikh Amīr al-Qādir Jilani with Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. What about the connection with the Prophet in terms of how he understood him and connected with him on the spiritual plane, and by extension the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya? Does he make reference to that in the Mawaqif?
Yes, of course. That's one of the longest chapter deals with the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya. He is aware, for sure, even before he started writing Mawaqif, maybe in his younger age, that he has a very special affinity with the Holy Prophet because of his lineage. It's a very pure, direct lineage. I mean, he has even his book. One of his books has the tree, the family tree, and not only that, like he belongs to a lineage of spiritual saints, like saintly people who are taking directly from their ancestor biologically and spiritually. Very aware of that. But of course, he has a major kind of encounter. I mean, this I mentioned that I think. Let me see. On my book or by the thesis, that he speaks about. He actually conveys a major vision of the Prophet. Let me just give me a second. Divine minds. Okay. I think I just need a moment here.
No problem. Take your time.
Okay. What is it? Oh, Muhammad and Arab. That's right. Okay. Okay, so he says here, I'm just going to maybe share this with you, it gives perspective to even people who are watching, will watch this or hear it. Let me see. Okay. Oh, there you go. I think you're able to see it, right, Sahib?
Yes, yes.
Okay, what I'll just read directly the quote. Al-Qādir is speaking about. You will see how he envisioned his basically his spiritual stature and station and the election that he was blessed with by God. He speaks about a science he inherited from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he writes here. I'll open the quote. What was divinely projected onto me through this verse, the verse 93:11. Is that the stated blessings of your Lord refer to the blessing of intimate knowledge of God, Ma'rifatullah, glory be to Him, and the sciences that the Prophet transmitted to us, blessing and peace upon them. These prophetic sciences are, among others, the ethical conduct and the beliefs in the unseen. There is no doubt that all these are the supreme blessing and attribute, and attributing blessings to other things. Sorry, I repeat it. There is no doubt that these are the supreme blessing, and attributing blessing to other things is metaphorical. Ever since God has shown me mercy, glory be to Him, by making me know myself, my inner self, bima'rifati nafsi, among the blessing that He conferred on me is that He only discourses with me through the sublime Quran, which falsehood comes not to it from before nor from behind it, ascending down from the all-wise, all-laudable. For it is known that divine discourse to the Quran is among the clear signs of the Muhammadan esoteric inheritance. For the Sufi tribe, the masters of this science have said, anyone whom God addresses through the esoteric language of a prophet inherit this science from him. Hence, if someone is addressed through the Quran, he is an heir to all the prophet and is therefore a Muhammadan heir, warithun Muhammadi. This is so because the Quran gathers all the revealed languages, just as the station of Muhammad ﷺ gathers all the spiritual station. So this is how he perceives basically his inheritance the Quran, from the Prophet ﷺ, and a wealth Muhammadi. But there's also a very compelling vision. During his time in Mecca, he is outside of the maqam of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and he tells, as he's doing his dhikr, kind of really submerged in his dhikr, and he every now and then he has state of basic ecstatic state where he loses self-awareness. And then on one occasion he mentions that on one as he's submerged, he has this inner urge of wanting to receive validation from the Prophet that he is maybe worthy of his companionship or of his love. And then he said, as this thought occurs to me, he hears the Prophet says from his tomb, he said, "Oh Abd, you are my son. You are from me, my son." And so he returns to his senses, and then but something else occurs to him. And he says, "Oh, did the Prophet say, did he mean that I am his biological son? If only he actually validates and he includes me with the fold of his spiritual heirs." And he also is submerged in the dhikr, and then he relates the Prophet walking out from his tomb. And he basically gives glad tidings. He says, literally, this is a wakeful vision. Like suddenly, the Prophet walks away, and he's just like throwing himself at the Prophet's feet, and the Prophet validates him as both his spiritual and his biological heir. And he said, then I think he relates, if I can remember, a moment of just ecstatic crying and weeping after having imagine a vision of the Prophet walking out from his tomb. So it is clear towards the end of his life, and maybe even before that, there is this happened before he went into Hira, or maybe I could be wrong, shortly thereafter. But that bond is so deep, like he recognizes, he's aware that he is an heir, a warith, one of the most elite spiritual saints of this tradition, that he was admitted into what they call the Diwan, the entourage of the Holy Prophet and his family and all the saints. So this is expressed in one vision, but also the last quote mentions about something even more remarkable, because he says that I am one of those who actually got discourses with through the Quran, affirming explicitly that he belongs to the elites of the saints. And this is how he expresses that relationship with the Prophet.
MashaAllah. So given that, Sidi Ramzi, I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation.
Yes.
And just imagine for a moment you are in your study. It's the middle of the night, and there is pin drop silence. There's nobody around. And as you're reading the Muwaqif, you look up, and on the chair opposite you see Sheikh Amīr Abd al-Qādir Jazā'irí, and he's smiling, and you have the whole night. He's there, as what would you ask him, and what do you think he would say?
MashaAllah, see a wonderful hypothesis. Well, to shed on a personal note, that although this would give me a better opportunity to discourse with him, I mean, by the grace of God, I've had the chance to the privilege of seeing him in a vision, and then before I started writing. I mean, so when you have a vision, you dream visions. You kind of dialoguing to your heart. There's no really volition in a sense. And so when you are so jarred by seeing something so remarkable, it was the first thing I asked from him is permission to write about him, right? To write or take from his write about his Kitab al-Waqif. And then as the traditional conventions and etiquettes go, I kissed his hand, and we kissed his hand, and this was sufficient as an indications of blessings, and at least honoring someone from your own traditions and someone you revere. If hypothetically, if we had a real wakeful vision where you could spend a long time, it's really difficult, because I would, of course, there's the convention. The second thing, really, to be quite honest, it's difficult to envision what the heart would ask. Of course, we would ask about because you could ask about their path, but that's not sufficient because no one walks the path of someone else. That's one of the things I learned. I mean, with my blessed Sheikh, what I would probably ask if I had the chance, because he was such a remarkable a man who, had no reason to humble himself, to let's say to anyone in fact, because mashallah, he was, as you say, born to be great in a sense. But I would love to receive some insight from him on the best etiquettes that you observe with your own sheikh, right? Because for me, and he makes sense. This was for me very poignant when he mentions that in the Mawaqif, that the supreme door to God and the Prophet, which is pretty much the desire and the wish of every seeker. What do you want to know God? That's your whole story. That's your life story. It's not a life story of someone else. And there are doors between you and God, and you cannot know Him before you know the Prophet, his most beloved. So one thing that seems to really strike me, if I had this chance, the first question would be, what would be the most appropriate way of serving your own spiritual guide? Because that you need a living door to walk you to the unseen door. And so he had that opportunity, and he was already a Arif, but he speaks with ardent words about how Sheikh Mas'ud al-Fasi was my supreme fatah was at his hand long. Everything seems to be poured on this someone who seems very incognito, not even known by anyone. And so this would be major, because as you grow and you mature in the spiritual path, you realize that if you are blessed with a living wasita, medium, intermediary between you and the Prophet, that really it's not about doctrine, it is not about reading text, it's because it's your story. It's not about you living the story of al-Arabi or Ghazali. We all love them, but they have lived and they have attained. What they can give us is this kind of unusual insight about the path. The path is a lot more about adab, venerations, and recognizing this is one of the biggest trap about the path is you think it's only in the past. The wilaya fades. Wilaya is wilaya of God. That the path of saintliness is only in the past, that the great saint, but the door of God is, as long as this life exists, there are saintly, godly people who are the direct inheritors, and they can shrink the path for you. Right? They can do it within one blink of. This is the Sufism. It's not rationalism. You could sit with a godly person, with maybe it depends on the clarity of your soul. Within 2 weeks, they can bring everything for you. So it would be at least one. This would be one of the most direct and personal thing that I would want to discourse with him, to dialogue with him on this. I mean, he has a path much more arduous. If it was a long night, of course, after they give me something, a treasure, that treasure, he gave it back to me. Of course, I would be, like he did, I would be basically reading with him his book, so that, I could maybe take that amana or that trust, and I can, in due course, speak about visionary, readings with the author of the Kitab al-Waqi, the same way that he did with Ibn Arabi. So once there's two sides to it. Of course, we would honor the presence of someone so saintly, but the fundamental thing was how to unlock what you call the matrix of your own story through someone who walked the path. And then the rest would be the privilege and the grace and the blessings of sitting with someone from the unseen, and then reading the text or maybe even they could, instead of reading page, they can tell you this is what you should know, and I give you a formula, like this is like the blue pill, where I can tell you what is really the essence and the secret of this book. And sometimes they can just tell you, and they can even hold your hand, and you can understand. That's what happens with with the al-Qādir Jazāījī. This is what happens with Qunawi, when he saw Ibn Arabi after his death, and he was just with his Kashani speaks about when Kashani or Jendi speaks about one day they were reading Fusus with Qunawi, and during a split of second, Qunawi did what they call tawajjuh, the orientation, the spiritual orientation of the Shaykh towards his teacher. He said, during that contact with my teacher, I understood all the intention of the Fusus. This is not rational. This is something that there's something really magnanimous about these people. So, if that was the case, that would be a long night on. It's all about the transmissions of things that cannot be rationally, the secrets of the path, the secret of your own story. They tell you maybe there is something very special about why you're studying their book, why your path is so, your destiny intermingled with this book and this figure. And that's what inshallah would be the conversation.
Thank you, Sidi. With that note, thank you so much for your time, and alhamdulillah, we've taken a long podcast, but I'm sure we can talk about Amir al-Qādir all night and all day and still not touch the surface. So, but I do look forward to, inshallah, more podcasts and engagement.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Saqib. All the best. I hope this podcast, bi'idhnillah, will reach a wide audience, and inshallah, it would be very beneficial, and not only to the podcast, but anyone who's just seeking something, to know something, to appreciate the legacy of great luminaries like al-Qādir Jazāījī, inshallah. And maybe bi'idhnillah, if once the book comes along, it would be in a different format, and maybe a different topic will be taken up in that. Maybe inshallah we can also meet again, and maybe narrow down to things that we haven't discussed in this podcast, inshallah.